In introducing this morning's session, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the context within which we launched the project. It's now sort of in the distant past almost for a lot of us. But one of the things that's really sort of crucial, I think, is to remember what that moment was surrounding the millennium and the series of conferences that were held across the country, in Montreal and in London and in Vancouver and in Fredericton and in various other places, all of which were asking much the same question. The question that was being asked was, where is history in the public domain today? And it was really reflecting on two sort of major shifts in the Canadian historical sort of environment over the previous 30 or 40 years. That is the very rapid expansion of history of Canada as a subject within universities. We saw Chad talking briefly about that yesterday. If you talked about it in a little more detail in terms of the growth of history departments and the growth of PhD programs, et cetera, you're really talking about a kind of exponential growth that occurs between the late 60s and the 90s, in a bit of a crisis by the 90s in various ways. Paralleling that was a similar kind of growth in what we might refer to as public history, seen through museums and historic sites and related kinds of activities that are taking place all across the country. And again, you had a growth spurt over that really relatively short period of time of about 30 or 40 years, where you went from having probably maybe at the very most about 100 museums in the country to having 2,600 over that period. And so that's a huge, huge change that takes place. So history is becoming much more in the face of Canadians in a whole variety of different kinds of ways. So what we had was the example of what the Americans and the Australians and others had done in terms of looking into the ways in which their citizens were engaging with the past. So we had some examples that we could follow. But what we did was to initiate a project within the context of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council's sort of program for community university research alliances, so that we could interact both with the academic community and with the public history community. So the result was Canadians and Their Pasts, which is an attempt to try to come to grips with the ways in which Canadians engage the past and how they see it as a part of their everyday existence. So central to that was a national survey. David's going to talk specifically about that in a moment or two. But the national survey asks people about what they do, what they think about what they do, how important they think various kinds of history are to them, and a variety of other kinds of issues that really parallel what was done in the United States and in Australia, but Canadianized them to some extent to ask a series of other questions that we felt were fairly pertinent to this kind of a context. David Northrup, who will speak first, is the Associate Director of the Institute for Social Research at York University. When we first sort of approached David to sort of become a part of the project, we thought he was some high-flying number cruncher, and we found out that he was a closet historian and taught us an awful lot about history along the way. And David's going to talk to us first about the way in which the survey was administered and what some of the major findings are. Jerry Friesen, who many of you in the room will know, is also one of the principal investigators. The University of Manitoba, who has a long and distinguished career and is now almost a whole month into being an emeritus professor. So he's joined the retired crowd. But Jerry will talk a little bit about what kinds of meanings we're beginning to tease out from the survey. We have a manuscript at the moment, which we're sort of shopping around in various kinds of ways. To some extent, what's going to happen this morning is a little bit of a summary of that manuscript, but it can only be a kind of teaser, I think, in terms of what the whole of the manuscript is going to be. David is going to talk for about 25 minutes. Jerry's going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll be open to questions, and they've promised me that they'll stay pretty well on schedule. Before I forget, Jocelyn asked me to mention to you that lunch is free. It's the only place where you get a free lunch, and it's in the lobby upstairs, the same place where the reception was. That's happening after the next session, so it's a little bit away, so don't run off and buy lunch somewhere. Okay, David's going to start.
I guess to be called a closet historian by Dell is a compliment. So as Dell mentioned, I want to sort of summarize some of the main findings of the study. And I want to try to initiate a conversation about the meaning and the relevance of these findings, which will be forwarded by Jerry. We can't cover everything, so we're really talking about highlights, but we are going to try to set aside time for questions. My talk is going to focus really on four large questions. What role does history play in Canadian lives? Does the role history plays vary by social demographic characteristics such as income, education, gender, and age? How much does where you live matter and how you engage the past in your everyday life? And to what extent do our findings support or differ from those of the American study and the Australian study? So we started out the survey, asked respondents how interested they were in Canadian history. And the truth is, we really started these questions because we wanted to start with something that we thought was easy. How interested are you in Canadian history? But they turned out to be kind of interesting for us. Over half of Canadians said they are very interested in the history of their family. About a third said they're very interested in history in general and in the history of Canada. We also asked respondents how much importance they placed on a number of different pasts, including the past of their country, the past of their province, the past of their family, the past of their religion, and the past of their ethnicity. Like the interest questions, the past that stood out for our response was family. It was sort of 2/3 of people telling us that the past of their family was very important. So the past, and I'm going to come back to this again, the past that was identified as least likely by our respondents was the past of the religion or spiritual tradition. Of course, it's very easy in a telephone conversation with a stranger to sort of say, sure, I'm interested in history. We want to try to get beyond that and sort of say, this interest, how is it reflected in the way Canadians engage in the past? We found that almost all Canadians participate in at least some past-related activities. About 4 in 5 Canadians over the last year told us they looked at photographs. About the same number told us they watched movies or TV programs about the past. About half visit places from the past that hold special meaning to them. This means going back to a hometown, going to a cemetery, going to a place of work, going to a trap line. About half told us they read a book about the past, and then about half told us they visited a historic site. About 40% told us that they had been to a museum in the last year, and about the same number told us that they had used the internet. That's one question where I think if even in the two plus years that we asked the survey, that if we asked that question now, I think the number would be much higher. About 1 in 5 told us they worked on their family tree or completed other genealogical research, and about the same number said they visited archives. These often go together. And 8%, and they were disproportionately young men, told us that they played computer history games. So in addition to participating in these activities, about 3/4 of Canadians told us that they were keeping something meaningful to pass on to family or friends or next generations. So I want to say something about family activities. In general, participation was highest for family-related activities. Participation in multiple family-related activities was also high. So 44% of our respondents, about half, told us that they had looked at photographs and were keeping heirlooms and had done scrapbooking. So they don't do one thing, they do this sort of whole mixture of things together. When we say that 20% of Canadians have worked on their family tree or completed other genealogical research in the last year, this means somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million Canadians have done so. When we say that about 50% of Canadians worked on scrapbooking or some other way of documenting the past, this means between 5 and 10 million Canadians have done this in the last year. Okay, so these numbers are staggering, and of course they're a lucrative commercial activity or opportunity. Commercial activities are growing up around packaging and selling the past, As a pastime, scrapbooking in the United States is more popular than the game of golf. Resources about how to scrapbook are everywhere. If you go to Indigo Books, for example, they list over 100 references to scrapbooking. And we start with things like Encyclopedia of Scrapbooking, and my favorite, Scrapbooking for Dummies. For those of us who need assistance in the construction of our family tree, we can obtain coaching and attend lectures with experts on cruise ships. So there's genealogical cruise, where all the programs are dedicated to different aspects of genealogical research. There's a whole commercial side of this public history that's going up as well. To add context to these questions about did you do it, we sort of said, tell us about the last time that you did this, tell us who it was with, what was the occasion, and why is this important or meaningful to you. So I think it's some context besides just, yes, I do this, or no, I don't. We're often struck by the commitment and ongoing time and effort, as well as the importance respondents placed upon their engagement with the past in these various ways. A Ukrainian-Canadian respondent in his mid-50s from Manitoba told the interview that he'd been working on his family history for more than 10 years. In that time, the family had held 2 reunions, and they had shared information on computer files, which are now available 365 days a year. It's a big network here. He explained how he had just heard about Ancestry.com on the radio about a week ago. It was a week before the survey. And he bought a membership and keyed it in. And there was his grandfather's name getting off the boat in Montreal in 1896. He conceded that in the larger scheme of his family history, finding that name of the ship was a tidbit that was somehow lost, but there's no denying sort of the excitement he brought to telling the interviewer about this story. So like our Ukrainian-Canadian respondent from Manitoba, most respondents to our survey explained their engagement with family history in highly personal terms. Their answers most often spoke to questions of identity and attempts to answer the age-old question, who am I? In the words of one Newfoundland respondent, family history doesn't seem to lose its genuineness as a story, even when you hear the story over and over again. Philosopher Ian Hacking explains this as, each of us becomes a new person as we redescribe the past. Say something brief about public history activities. As was the case in both the US and Australian studies, public history, especially as provided in museums and historic sites, was popular with Canadians. 1/5 of our respondents reported reading a book about the past, visiting a museum, and visiting a historic site. But participation in public history was less about personal identity and more about understanding and connecting to the past. Although only about 1/3 of Canadians told us they felt very connected to the past when they engaged in public history, those who did exuded excitement and passion for the past. The tangible nature of the past was a critical component of this connectedness. For example, twice as many people reported they felt very connected to the past when they were at a historic site as opposed to doing something on the web. The thrill of actually standing on the spot where historical events occurred was conveyed by a number of respondents. This is a story from an 84-year-old gentleman from a small town in Ontario. And so you can see the key bits here. Right? You're right there, where it happened. You know, there's an aura about this. And he's talking about St. John in Newfoundland. He says, they landed here. It meant right here, right there. This is where the trail was. You know, not 100 yards down the line, but right here. And he said, that's something. And he talks about just putting hackles on his back. And he says, I'm not sure if everybody feels that way, but I did. This sense of awe and emotional connection resulting from being right there is what Lori Jane Smith calls a moment of heritage. As Smith points out, these personal connections are not constrained by a historian's concern for accuracy, but rather touch people because of the meaning the experience has for them in the present. So, this story is about now, not the past. I have 2 final observations about the role history plays in Canadian lives. I'll move on to my next question. The first is about the internet, and the second is the relationship between being interested and engaging in the past. The internet as a tool to explore the past is a very recent phenomenon. It's recent enough that it did not make the list of questions asked in the US survey, for example. Given the popularity of the internet, as well as the ease of using it, we were not surprised to find that 40% of our respondents told us that they used the internet to use the past in the last year, use the internet to look up something about the past, and 2/3 of them said they used it more than 5 times. And it was obvious for some of them 5 times was 10 or 20 or 30. Those who use the internet used it a lot. The internet's also changed in the way people explore the past. One respondent said to us, now I probably use the internet to find a book. Then I go get the book and read it. Clearly, the internet has opened up a new way of exploring the past, and the general public has seized this opportunity. How academic and public historians react to this change will say much about the extent to which history is practiced by the lay public and history as practiced by professionals will come together or grow apart over the next decades. The relationship between having an interest in history and participating in activities is instructive. Remember we had those 30 people who were very interested in history? Those people were 2 or 3 times more likely to engage the past and engage the past multiple times. So saying that you're interested was highly related to going out and doing things. So based on that relationship between interest and consuming, documenting, and interpreting the past as measured in activity questions, it's pretty clear to us that when respondents tell us they are very interested in history, their answers are based upon action. Being interested in the past, as told to us in our survey, is not a polite answer to the survey question. It's rather evidence of a person for whom the past is meaningful and important. I want to move to my second question, which is about social demographic characteristics. So here we're interested in is if the interest in the past and this engagement in the past is universal or just certain segments of the population do it. So we looked at education, gender, income, age, ethnicity, religion, and whether or not the respondent had children. And I'll go through these each quite quickly. So education is a very powerful predictor of participation in past-related activities. It's the most powerful predictor we found for anything that we did in the survey. Essentially, for every step up in educational achievement, you have an increase in the likelihood of participating in the activity. And this is true for almost all the activities. Education was also associated with a higher level of interest in history and a higher level of interest in Canadian history. But education was not associated with high interest in the family past. Okay? Education was also not related to saying that past of your family was very important. So education matters a lot, but where we don't see education making a big difference is when it comes to family. All right? And this sort of suggests that while education is important to the way they engage the past, the centrality of family history is not mediated by education. The education finding is not really a surprise, of course. High levels of education are associated with higher earnings, better health, less prejudice, increased political participation, higher self-esteem, more leisure time, more reflectivity about life around you. So the real surprise would have been if we did not find that education was related to engagement in the past. So gender. Just as we would expect education to matter, we would anticipate that women and men would have different levels of engagement with different aspects of the past. Women were more likely than men to participate in history-related activities centered on the family. They're more likely to report that they worked on scrapbooks, were keeping heirlooms, that looked at old photographs, and visited places from their family past, and worked on a family tree. Women higher in those activities, most of them family-related. Men were more likely to report using the internet to explore the past, to play computer history games, to read books about the past, and to watch movies on TV programs about the past. However, with the exception of scrapbooking and documenting family history, the differences between men and women tend to be sort of 5 to 10% range. So they tend to be smaller, not larger. Okay, income. Of course, income and education are closely related. But if we do a little bit of fancy math, if we take education effects into account and then say what's left that just has to do with income, with the exception of museum attendance, income is not an important predictor of the likelihood of engagement in the past. For some of the history-related activities, education is sort of a weak predictor. For some of them, it's not a predictor at all. So the education effect is pretty marginal. Age, this is probably a little bit to our surprise. The relationship between age and engagement in the past was generally weak. As might be predicted, respondents under 30 years of age were generally less engaged in the past than their elders. It was not the case, however, that increases in participation were matched by increasing each age cohort. So in education, we see as we went up the education scale, levels of participation went up. This is not the case for age. Those under 30 tend to be different than the rest. Those over 75 tend to sort of trail off in a lot of their participation rates. But in general, the young were different from all else. Those in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and their 60s, there was not a lot to distinguish them on the way they participated in activities about the past, and not that much to distinguish them in the way they thought about the past in terms of interest and importance. Ethnicity and religion. Our general finding is neither ethnicity nor religion were significant or consistent predictors of engagement in the past. We do note that ethnic groups whose population is located overwhelmingly in large Canadian cities are different from other Canadians, and so we sort of have this type of effect. But when we look at ethnicity and religion, we find the difference is not so much are you British or are you Scottish or are you East Indian. We find the difference has got to do with being a recent immigrant as opposed to what we might think of as a settled immigrant. And Jerry's going to talk about immigration, I think, a bit in his presentation. Parental status. We were surprised with this finding as well. When we were developing the questionnaire, we were sitting around and a number of us were talking about remembering, when my parents, or when as a family we went to a museum, or we went to a historic site, or we went back to visit the hometown. And so we kind of thought that parental status would have a big effect on the way people engage in the past. But again, we find the effects of parental status quite weak. Surprisingly, for example, those with and without children were keeping heirlooms at about the same rate. So what can we make of all the slicing and dicing of the data by social demographic characteristics? Well, education and gender correlate with levels of engagement in ways that we would expect. We would be wrong to dwell at great length on the differences among Canadians in relationship to history. Canadians, whether rich or poor, middle-aged or older, with or without children, use the past to situate themselves in the present, to fill their leisure hours, and to connect with themselves to others. So the third question I had was, how much does where you are from matter in how you engage the past in your everyday life? One of the questions that intrigued our research group from the start was the extent to which traditional regions of the country would matter to the way Canadians thought about the past. I think it actually even brought a couple members onto the team. So media, educators, writers, artists, musicians, academics, we all sort of explore and reflect regional identities in Canada in the work or the art that we do. We have four main findings about the relationship between past and place of residence, and then a conclusion that doesn't match any of the four findings. When it comes to the presence of the past in everyday life, Quebec is a distinct region and province in Canada, but not in the way that we would expect. In general, for the interest and importance questions, Quebec respondents expressed a more modest attachment to the past. For all but one of the activities, the exception being playing computer history games, Quebecois fell below the Canadian average with respect to participation rates. The differences were typically small, 5 to 7% range, but the consistency of the pattern is remarkable, question after question after question. No other province or region was consistently last in interest, in importance, and engagement. And I assume that will bring up questions at the end. Second, there is no sustained evidence to suggest that any other region or province stands apart from the rest of the country. We could find an example where a province or region was unique for everything. But in terms of finding overall patterns, they just weren't there. So for example, differences within the Atlantic region are as large as differences between the four provinces that make up the region and the rest of Canada. We also have a prairie region. In the prairie region, sometimes Alberta looks more like BC, and sometimes it looks more like its cousins of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We could find no evidence in the way Canadians participated or think about the past that there was some kind of provincial or regional identity that differences in the way people express their interest. Third, our third conclusion, the rural-urban divide that has been a major fault line in Canadian politics and the media is not reflected in how Canadians engage the past. Exactly the same percentage of urban and rural respondents report their interest in the past. There is also no difference in the likelihood of each group saying that the past of their family was important. In addition, there was really very little variation in expressions of interest and importance of the past of the nation or of the province. There was Whether you live in a rural or urban environment, the likelihood of looking at photographs, setting aside heirlooms, visiting historic sites, working on your family tree, visiting an archive, they're all the same. So there was not rural or urban differences. Fourth, there's an interesting contrast between respondents in the East and the West with respect to the level of importance they assign to Canada's past and the past of the province in which they reside. So respondents living in Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, sort of Ontario West, attach far greater importance to the past of Canada than they do to the province in which they reside. Quebec and the Maritime provinces attach much more importance to the provincial past. The idea that, I mean, Ontario is not maybe so surprising, sort of maybe we could argue benefit most of the Confederation. It's in the central part of the country. But the idea that people living in British Columbia and Alberta consider the national past more important than the provincial past seems counterintuitive. For more than a century, the West expressed resentment towards the East, and they've established political parties to work on this resentment. Okay, so surely this posture should translate into some kind of strong engagement or interest or promotion of a provincial past. I actually skipped this one. Okay, so this paradox, we think, can be explained in part by what we're calling the relentless mobility of Canadians. Many Easterners have made their home in the West. This fact was impressed upon us when, in our data file, we found that 45% of people in Alberta and British Columbia who were born in Canada were not born in those provinces. So the first thing we did is we went to Stats Canada and said, does our data look like Stats Canada? And it was exactly the same. So this sort of high proportion of people who came from another part of Canada. No other provincial jurisdiction looks like this in Canada. And since migrants from other provinces bring a broader Canadian perspective to bear in the place where they live, this is reflected in the choices they make about the past that they consider to be important. Now, movers, these people from the East who went to the West, or from Ontario to the West, movers, people born in one province and now living in another, saw the past of Canada as being more important than stayers. So this right here, this slide right here, is for the past of the province in Canada. So this is the province, this is Canada, and you can see in Newfoundland, province is very high, right? PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, quite similar, but as you go, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, you can see that decline in the importance placed upon the past of the province. And I can't, Chad had this really nice drop down. I don't have something so neat, but if you just look at this, this is for stayers, this is for leavers. So you can flip back and forth. See the blue bars go up in the West? All right? Those blue bars going up in the West is stayers, all right, and leavers. It's this difference. This is people who have moved, telling us that the importance of Canada is very important, and being less likely to tell us that the importance of their province is very important. So this sort of, what we first thought was a paradox of people in the West not identifying a provincial heritage or past as being very important, we think it is explained largely by this type of movement. So other than the Quebec distinction, which is modest and not overwhelming, we have found that where you live is defined by province, region, rural or urban area, is not a predictor of how you relate to the past. This is not the same as saying that the place where you live does not affect how you relate to the past. All right? Rather, it means that the relationship between the past and place transcends these type of political boundaries. Right? The depth of attachment people form with place and the relationship between place and past happens in every region, in every province, in rural areas where farmers relate to the land, and in neighborhoods and large metropolitan centers where children relate to family, ethnic, and cultural groups, and lifelong friendships are made. Place matters, but it is local, it is intimate, and is not necessarily defined by political boundaries. Okay, my last question. To what extent do our findings support or differ from the results of similar work in the United States and Australia? Our main finding is one of similarities rather than differences across the three countries. There was considerable consistency across the three countries with respect to both the proportion of respondents who engaged in activities and the relative importance of these questions on the list. In both Canada and the United States, education was strongly associated with engagement in activities related to the past. The family past was identified as the most important past by a considerable margin of respondents in both Canada and the United States. The Australians refrained from asking such a direct question, but in responses to various other questions, and the historical content interest question asked, it's clear that Australians also have a strong allegiance to the past of their family. So the past of family identifies the most important past in all three places. In all three countries, people felt most connected to the past when they visited historic sites and looked at old photographs. I've not summarized our findings with respect to trust and sources of historical information, but I can say that museums were identified as the most trustworthy sources of information in all three countries. In the United States and in Canada, regional differences were minimal. So in general, the American South looked about the same as the East, the North, East, or the West, just like Atlantic Canadians generally looked like other Canadians when it came to the way they engaged in and the importance that they assigned to the past. There's a small number of differences that are intriguing. Religion plays a more important role in the United States than it does in Canada and Australia. Genealogy seems more important in Australia than in Canada and the United States. One notable difference between Canada and the other two countries is the importance accorded to national history. The differences in the way that questions were asked make this a little bit tricky to distill, but we think that the importance assigned to national history in Canada is lower than that of both the United States and in Australia. So given the overall similarity of the findings, explanations for why history matters in these countries need to be common rather than unique. The search for personal and family identity in a postmodern world is the heart of engagement with the past, but it's clearly not the whole story. Interest in the past has come at a time of economic growth, increasing financial security, and educational achievement. As Engelhardt and others have argued, the development of post-industrial economy is accompanied by a change in values. At the individual and family level, personal well-being, quality of life, self-expression, involvement in local causes have become more important. It is in this context of changing values where identity has become so important that we need to place the high levels of engagement in the past that we have found.